Today, we're going to talk about the best way to pan roast or grill steaks. Now, conventional wisdom among professional chefs is when you put your steak into a hot pan or on top of a hot grill, you should leave it alone while the sear creates that perfect crust. In fact, you can find hundreds of videos on YouTube more or less giving this advice. For example, millions of people have watched this video of Gordon Ramsay's tips for the perfect steak.
For me, it's all about the searing. Make sure you have an amazing sear on that steak and don't turn it unless it's colored. Remember, no color, no flavor.
The question is this really the best way to cook a steak? And to answer that, we have to define what do we mean by best. Speaking for myself personally, a great steak has a rich, flavorful crust with a mahogany color. It's cooked evenly from edge to edge, and if one approach gets the steak done more quickly than another, so much the better. Now, the first person that I know of who really looked at this question with a critical eye was the GOAT of food science writing, Harold McGee. Back in 1999, with his co-authors Jack McInerney and Alon Harris, he published a paper in the journal Physics Today titled The Virtual Cook, Modeling Heat Transfer in the Kitchen. And among many things they looked in that paper was the question, how frequently should you flip your steak for the best result? And for them, the best result was evenly cooked and done as quick as possible. I first became aware of this paper and its counterintuitive result as a young chef cooking at the Fat Duck restaurant in the early 2000s. And a few years later, I ended up writing about this technique with my co-author Nathan Myhrvold in Modernist Cuisine. But both Harold's experiments and our experiments at Modernist Cuisine were all in silico, which is to say, all of these cooks were simulated. I've never actually done the experiment side by side in a controlled fashion to see if theory really holds up to reality. So that's what we're going to do today to answer the question, how frequently should you flip your steak? So let me explain my experimental setup. As with any experiment, my goal is to try to keep as many variables controlled as possible. So in the case of the steak, I'm using filet mignon because from one cut to the next, the steak is very uniform, the muscle doesn't change a lot, so we should expect one steak to cook very similar to the next. And I've used my digital calipers to cut them either into 2-inch thick steaks or half that thickness at 1 inch. For the actual cooking of the steaks, I'm going to use a carbon steel skillet on top of a Breville Polyscience Control Freak induction burner. This is a fairly unique induction burner that lets me set the temperature of the pan, and it will maintain that temperature consistently from one cook to the next. So that way, I don't really have to worry about my burner varying or the pan being different for one cook to the next. For the actual cooking temperature, for the thinner steak, I'm going to use a hotter temperature of 350 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about a medium-high heat. And for the 2-inch steak, because it's going to spend more time searing, I'm actually going to lower the temperature by about 25 degrees to 325 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, you do need some oil in the pan to help with that searing, and you could imagine that the amount of oil ends up somewhat variable. So instead, I'm going to actually brush the oil onto the surface of the steak before searing so that the amount of oil on each steak is very consistent from steak to steak. Finally, to actually measure the temperature at the center of the steak as it cooks, I'm going to use this Predictive Thermometer from Combustion Inc. By inserting it through the midpoint all the way through, I can rely on its multi-sensor technology to find out where the true core is so that I can keep track of that as it cooks. Now, I'm going to cook the steaks one of two ways. First, I'm going to cook it the conventional way, where I'll flip it about halfway through, which is around 70 Fahrenheit, with the steak being removed from the heat at 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and then I'm going to let carryover cooking during resting finish the job of heating the steak through to about 130 degrees Fahrenheit, a nice medium rare. The alternative way I'm going to cook the steak is flipping it every 30 seconds until it hits that same 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Then I'm going to remove it and again allow carryover cooking during resting to finish the job of cooking. Let's get started. So for a 1-inch steak, we can see that the steak that was flipped every 30 seconds is more evenly cooked through and cooked through faster compared to the steak that was conventionally cooked and flipped only once halfway through. We can also see that the steak that was flipped every 30 seconds has a crust that's at least as appealing and, to my eye, even a little bit better looking compared to the crust on the steak that was flipped once halfway through cooking. The question is, does this matter as much as the steak gets thicker? Let's find out. Here are the steaks from our 2-inch thick experiment. This steak was flipped every 30 seconds during cooking, while this steak was flipped halfway through cooking. Both steaks were cooked until the core reached 110 degrees Fahrenheit and then allowed to rest until the core reached its peak temperature. You can see that this steak that was flipped every 30 seconds is more evenly cooked than this steak, but there's still a large amount of overcooking beneath the surface. And being honest, standing there for 20 minutes turning a steak every 30 seconds is a bit tedious. As a steak starts to get 2 inches thick, there are frankly better techniques for cooking it evenly, and we'll talk about those in the future. Before I get into the science of what's going on here, why does this counterintuitive technique even work? You might wonder, why should you believe me? After all, who am I? My name's Chris Young, and I've been combining science and cooking for almost 2 decades. While I studied mathematics and chemistry, I actually ended up becoming the head development chef for the 3 Michelin star Fat Duck restaurant in the early 2000s. After that, I co-authored Modernist Cuisine with Nathan Myhrvold before founding Chef Steps and creating the Joule sous vide circulator. These days, I'm the founder of a company called Combustion Inc., where we're building this wireless predictive thermometer and its kitchen timer. Now, this can just be used as a really fast, good instant read thermometer, but its actual superpower is to use its 8 temperature sensors to answer 2 really common cooking questions. How long does my food need to cook for, and how long should I let it rest so that it ends up at my perfect doneness every time? Watch till the end of this video and I'll tell you how you can win one of these for your own kitchen when they begin shipping in August. Now let's get into the science of what's going on here. To understand why frequently flipping a steak both cooks it more evenly and more quickly, we have to understand how heat flows into food in the first place. Recall that heat flows from hot to cold, and the further apart hot and cold are, the faster that heat energy flows in. When our cold steak hits the surface of a ripping hot pan or is laid on top of a really hot grill, the surface of that steak jumps up to the boiling point of water almost instantly. That's why we hear the sizzle of liquid water at the surface flashing to steam. At that moment, heat energy, which is measured in the unit of joules, is flowing really rapidly into our steak. In a really hot pan or in a hot grill, easily more than 1,000 joules every second can be flowing into our steak, raising its temperature. Joules per second, by the way, happens to be the definition of a watt, so more than 1,000 watts of power can be applied to our steak. That's a lot of power, but it starts to fall off quickly, because as the temperature inside our food starts to rise, the difference in temperature between outside and inside get closer together, and the flow of energy slows. In fact, if you try to cook a steak entirely from one side, you never quite get there, because at some point, the loss of energy out the top of the steak balances the flow of energy into the steak. You get a crispy bottom and a raw top. That's why we flip our food. But there's a problem with infrequently flipping our steak. Each time we flip the steak to the relatively cold side, we get a surge of peak power. And it's the peak power that's responsible for overcooking the meat beneath the surface. It turns out it would be better to have a larger number of more moderate sized spikes. And that's what we get by frequently flipping our steak. Each time we frequently flip, the other side is still relatively warm. There's less of a power surge. But by having a lot more frequent spikes, the average power the steak experiences is higher than a few flips with a big peak power. And it's the average power that is responsible for how fast the steak cooks. It's the peak power that's responsible for how much overcooking occurs. So we want to moderate our peaks, but we want to have a larger number of them. And that's really why frequently flipping a steak works. But there's a catch with the technique of frequent flipping. And it's one that I've never seen Harold McGee or anyone else who's written about this technique discuss before. And frankly, it surprised me. You have to allow for a greater temperature rise at the core during the carryover cooking of resting. While we've applied our heat energy more moderately with this technique, the average power has been higher, which means there's more energy that's built up inside our steak that has to even out and raise the core temperature during that carryover cooking period. It's actually hard to guesstimate just how much more this resting temperature rise is going to be, which is one benefit of a predictive thermometer, because computers are a lot better at this kind of thing than humans. This is all fascinating and intellectually interesting, but how practical is this to incorporate into your steak cooking technique? Well, here's how I do it. First, start by warming the steak for 10 to 20 minutes at room temperature. Having the steak start cooking warmer reduces that initial surge of power into the steak that will overcook some of the meat. Second, use oil. If you've got a good hood in your kitchen, go ahead and fill up the pan with plenty of oil. If you don't, like me, then go ahead and brush some oil onto the meat. That's going to result in a lot less smoke in your kitchen. Third, use a digital thermometer, really. Unless you're cooking the same steak that's cut to the same thickness over the same heat, it's hard to time things perfectly. Using a digital thermometer takes the guesswork out of perfect timing. Fourth, flip your steak frequently. Every 30 seconds is great, but even about once a minute is nearly as good. Fifth, allow for that carryover cooking during resting. In my experiments, I typically see a temperature rise of 25 degrees Fahrenheit during resting. Sixth, while the steak's resting, brown some butter with some flavorful herbs. I like thyme, rosemary, and bay. And then just before you slice the steak, baste the steak with that mix. Not only will it add a bunch of flavor, but it'll also heat up the surface a bit, which is cooled during resting. Finally, add some fresh ground pepper at the end. Enjoy. Earlier in this video, I said there'd be a way for you to win a predictive thermometer and kitchen timer from Combustion Inc. I put the details of how to text to win in the description below. We're giving everybody who enters a $20 discount from any purchase at Combustion Inc. And each week in the month of July, we're going to be choosing 5 winners of a predictive thermometer and kitchen timer bundle from Combustion Inc. While you're down there, click subscribe and hit that bell icon so that you don't miss my next video, which is going to look at 2 popular divide and conquer techniques for cooking the perfect steak, the reverse sear and the sous vide and sear. Thanks for watching.